Hello, dear friends. Welcome back to this next installment of the life and times of Edward II. This life has been full of controversy and strife, whether or not it is his close relationships, loving relationships with male courtesans and nobles, a terrible performance in military expeditions in Scotland, and his extravagant expenditure, particularly on wine, where he's spending nearly £500,000 on it. We now move on to a section titled Pirates and Sea Monsters. Always fascinating, isn't it, to explore pirates and sea monsters. So we have a illustration here of a pitched battle at sea between marauding pirates and army, probably Cinqueport mariners and a merchant ship. There was little distinction between lawful mariners and pirates during the 14th century. When the mariners of the Cinque Ports were concerned, there was often no difference at all. So when Edward II entrusted his exiled favourite Hugh Despenser to their care, he was virtually recommending him to take up sea robbery. Interesting. Piracy was nothing new to the inhabitants of the Cinque Ports. The five towns of Hastings, Romney, Hythe, Dover and Sandwich, their confederates from Rye and Wilne Chelsea. They formed the first line of defence against French invasion. They had long provided most of the ships of the King's walls, and in return a blind eye was turned when they attacked and despoiled not only enemy ships, but also those of peaceful foreign allies and even of fellow Englishmen. It all sounds a bit Mad Maxy, doesn't it? Like, why would you allow... I mean, fair enough, they're protecting you against invading forces, but you can't have them robbing your fellow countrymen. It kind of defeats the point, doesn't it? You may end up getting your citizens wishing for an invasion. In the early 13th century, the sea monsters included Eustace the monk, perhaps the most notorious pirate of the Middle Ages, the son of a knight from Boulogne, who spent his monastic youth studying the black arts, abandoning religion for piracy, and became King John's favourite freebooter, based at Winchelsea. In 1212, however, he went over to Prince Louis of France and harried his erstwhile accomplices so successfully that he was said to have been able to make his vessel and himself invisible. At the Battle of Sandwich in 1217, Cinque Port's ships attacked him 4-1, throwing quicklime into the wind to blind his crew. The Devil's Monk, discovered hiding in the bilges, offered a vast ransom of £6,600, but his former henchman Stephen of Winchelsea decapitated him on the ship's rail, and his head was triumphantly displayed throughout England. There we go, there's a medieval one-piece for you there. The Cinque Ports mariners were not the only offenders, judging by the constant stream of complaints and counter-complaints that passed between the rulers of England, France, Spain and Flanders. Many medieval seamen succumbed to the temptations to turn temporary sea monster when they encountered a weak foreign ship. The victims' crew were usually tipped overboard. Certainly the habit of Chaucer's late 14th century shipman, who was probably based on a real-life buccaneer. If he fought and had the higher hand, by water he sent them home to every land. To make matters worse, monarchs issued their aggrieved subjects with letters of marque, which entitled merchants who had lost money or goods in this way to use force to recover an equivalent amount from any of the culprits' fellow countrymen, in fact to become licensed pirates themselves. That's what a bizarre way of solving that problem. Your house is on fire, so go and set fire to somebody else's house. Is almost what that's saying. What's going on there? These years also produced a female pirate, the Breton Jean de Belleville, who, to avenge her husband's execution by the French, preyed on their shipping and invariably led her crew onto the hostile deck in person. So, as is always the case within this particularly wonderful book, we have in yellow Chronicles of the Age, which were written by contemporary sources of the time, so we get a lovely first-hand account of what's going on. Now we know that the king's enrichment of the younger Despenser infuriated the marcher lords, Despenser being one of the king's favourites. They formed a league with Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, and marched on London, demanded that Edward exile both the hated Despensers, father and son, threatening that unless he complied, they would renounce their homage and disown him as king. So pretty violent there. And seeing how violently he was attacked, unwillingly granted the barons' requests. Then the Archbishop of Canterbury was sent on behalf of the king to summon the barons to Westminster, where they were to meet in the king's presence and obtain what reason demanded. When all had assembled there, the complaints and petitions of the barons just judgment confirmed by such weight of authority should never be reserved. Observe now how 2 men counted amongst the magnates of the land, and until recently the particular intimates of the King of England himself, reluctantly left their native soil and splendour. When this affair had been settled, Hugh Despenser the father betook himself to foreign lands, but Hugh the son remained at sea, as the king had commended him to the protection of the sailors of the Cinque Ports. He became a sea monster, a pirate, laying in wait for merchants as they crossed his path. He was master of the seas, their merchandise and goods, and no ship got through unharmed. He attacked a great Genoese ship called the Drummond, killed the crew, and took for himself the vast wealth that he found in it. Meanwhile, the king determined to attack those magnates who had forced the Despensers into exile, because they had seized the fortresses of the banished men and had disgracefully destroyed their manors. First of all, the king attacked Bartholomew Lord Badlesmere, and personally besieged his castle at Leeds in Kent. The greater marcher lords assembled to bring help to the besieged, but the Earl of Lancaster made it impossible to send the promised aid, for the Earl hated Bartholomew and held him responsible for various wrongs for which he judged him worthy of perpetual imprisonment or at least exile. Without assistance, the besieged were not strong enough to resist, so they surrendered the castle, and within it the king found robbers, homicides, and traitors. Some he ordered to be drawn, others to be hanged, and the rest imprisoned, for King Edward II wished to make an example of them so that no one in the future would dare to hold fortresses against him. Then the king sent a force to seize the other castles of Bartholomew, and of the Earl of Hereford, and of others. None resisted, because the vengeance exacted on those at Leeds had terrified them. The king not only confiscated the manors of the barons who had engineered the Despensers' exile, but also plundered all their adherents and their supporters. When, therefore, the king had seized the baronial strongholds in the east, he made ready to do the same in the west. He assembled a large army to go to the Welsh March and attack the magnates who were in control in that region. There the barons who found their safest refuge, in an area difficult for the king to penetrate without a strong force. Wow, so again it's so messy, all of this is so personally driven that it doesn't feel like it has an end. It isn't really something that's been done for the good of the people or the nation or progressing things forward. It is just sniping and bullying and death and vindication. So sieges and stratagems. Here's Leeds Castle in Kent, which is absolutely beautiful, isn't it? Look at that. Go and visit that today, if you wish. Beautiful. Something out of a fairy tale. It was besieged by Edward II in 1321, who used ballista against its inhabitants. So there were many ways of attacking a medieval fortress, almost as many means of countering such attacks. So the first step was to batter the walls with a variety of engines, and the most common of which was the catapult or mangonel. Its throwing beam was hauled back with a windlass and powered by a twisted skein of sinews, or better still, of human hair. And when released, the beam struck a massive crossbow and hurled its missile, a stone, or a pot of flaming Greek fire, occasionally a dead horse to infect the garrison, or a captured messenger, to show that all hope of relief was in vain. Could you imagine a messenger of yours being flung over the wall? That would be terrifying. The ballistas, or springholes used by Edward II against Leeds Castle in Kent in the siege of 1321, were essentially huge crossbows that fired either stones or giant arrows, as did the primitive cannon that joined the besiegers' arsenal in the mid-14th century. They were far more accurate than other siege engines, but because they were unreliable and difficult to transport, they were initially more useful to stationary defenders. If battering was ineffective, it was sometimes possible to undermine the walls, particularly at a vulnerable right-angle corner, because some distance away, and if possibly concealing their shaft, professional miners burrowed beneath the defences, supporting their tunnel with wooden props. Then they filled the mine with combustible materials. At Rochester in 1216, the fat of 40 pigs, and fired them, burning away the supports, collapsing the tunnel, with luck demolishing the wall above it. If a garrison knew or suspected that their position was being undermined, they could sometimes locate the underground workings by standing filled water jugs in different parts of the fortress and observing them when they vibrated. He could then sink a countermine from inside the fortress and either slaughter the opposing diggers in hand-to-hand fighting or flood their tunnel with water. I've only just realised now, of course, the term undermine. If somebody's undermining me, is literally to mine underneath a wall, to besiege. So undermining me. You're going against my authority. You're using underhand tactics. There we go. Every day is a school day with the English gentleman ASMRA. So castles surrounded by moats or founded on solid rock were virtually impervious to mining, and in these cases it was necessary to storm walls using suicidally hazardous scaling ladders and perhaps a belfry or a malthus in a bad neighbour, which is a wheeled tower whose uppermost platform was levelled with the wall top. So the besiegers would also assault the wooden gate at the fortress, probably its most vulnerable point, using more often than not an iron-headed battering ram swung from the framework covered with wet hides. These hides gave protection against fire pots that were dropped from above, along with javelins, stones, boiling oil, and what can only be described as boiling porridge, a scalding oatmeal mush which stuck to besiegers' skins. That's horrible, isn't it? Actually, weaponized porridge. When you're at the outer gate, the attackers might find themselves trapped in a passage between two portcullises, showered with missiles from murder holes in its roof, and the best way to avoid such horrors was to mount a surprise attack, a tactic much favoured by Edward II's Scottish guerrilla opponents, who generally lacked the resources for a formal siege. On a dark night in 1314, for example, Sir James Douglas's men donned cowhides and approached Roxburgh Castle on all fours, deceiving the watch until they were close enough to throw up their grapnel scaling ladders. Oh my word, they basically wore pantomime cow costumes and crawled up to the castle. That would be hilarious if it wasn't so terrifying. A traitor within the walls was more effective. The most inexorable were hunger and thirst. All castles had wells, but if these ran dry or were poisoned, the defenders ultimately had to surrender. A waterless French garrison that attempted to subsist on wine soon became incapable of resistance. Treachery or blockade, indeed, probably encompassed the downfall of more medieval fortresses than ever fell to siegecraft. Here we have a Lanacross chronicler depicting a vivid description of Edward II's last and once more disastrous expedition against the Scots. So on the 1st of August, the King of England came to Newcastle upon Tyne. Soon afterwards, he invaded Scotland with a mighty army, but the Scots, as usual, retreated, not daring to fight with him. However, in early September, the English were forced to withdraw, partly by lack of supplies, partly because of illness in the army, which was ravaged by a type of dysentery. As soon as the English had gone, the King of Scots assembled a massive force and crossed the Solway Firth into England. King Edward sent John, Duke of Brittany, Earl of Richmond, with a troop to reconnoitre the Scots' position from the hill between the abbeys of Riverlow and Byland. In fact, John and his troop came face to face with the Scots suddenly, and without warning had to try to prevent them from climbing the narrow path up the hill by hurling rocks at them. But the enemy made a fierce, bold descent and captured many of them, including John of Brittany, although some escaped. The king himself was then at Riverlow Abbey when news of the encounter reached him. He, who was always faint-hearted and unlucky in war, and had always been avoiding battle in Scotland out of fear, now took to flight even in England. Leaving behind his silver vessels and other treasure in his haste to quit the monastery, King Edward II fled to York. Shortly afterwards the Scots arrived at Riverlow. They carried off the king's valuables and despoiled the monastery, then set off across the wolds, taking John, Earl of Richmond, with them. They laid waste the whole region. As for Beverley, where the town people paid heavily to be spared from destruction. So in 1323 the Scots agreed to a 12-year truce with the English, and the next year, as the life of Edward II shows, were ready to discuss peace. So it was agreed by common consent that the parties should meet at York for negotiations. There the King of England met certain Scottish magnates who put forward demands that Scotland should be forever free from every English exaction, and that by right of conquest and lordship the whole land which they had perambulated should be free as far as the gates of York. The Scots demanded that the royal stone of Scone should be restored to them, which Edward I had long ago taken from Scotland and placed at Westminster by the tomb of St. Edward the Confessor. Robert Bruce proposed that his daughter should be joined in marriage with the king's son, and finally the Scots wished that the promises of the nobles should be confirmed by the King of France in the presence of the Pope, so that a treaty of peace, strengthened by such authority, should never be broken. When King Edward II heard the Scottish proposals, he said, "The Scots have come to us not to make peace, but to seek opportunities for further discord and for unprovoked breaches of the truce. To grant these demands would be much to our loss, and they will return to their own country without satisfaction, for how, without prejudice to our crown, revealed, therefore, that the king did not approve their terms, nor could he be forced to make such an ignoble peace, although the troops continued to win. His desire to make peace with the Scots stemmed in part from his anxieties about the Duchy of Gascony, which he was delayed from doing homage to Charles IV, King of France, since 1322, and a French force invaded Gascony in 1324, forcing a truce on its English defenders. Pope John XXII intervened and sent messengers to Paris. They suggested that Charles IV's sister, Queen Isabella of England, would be a suitable ambassador and peacemaker. The events which followed are unfolded by the lively, if sometimes inventive, Geoffrey Le Baker, and unlike the other chroniclers, he shows considerable sympathy for Edward II. So we're on to the tail end of his life now in this chronicle. We were told in the first part that Geoffrey Le Baker is rather melodramatic in his account, so let's get a taste of that now. 1325. Queen Isabella, the only sister of the King of France, Charles IV, at last saw the dear face of her beloved brother and embraced him after a long separation. She was to act as intermediary between the two kings, her brother and her husband. King Edward II, Isabella's husband, stayed in Kent throughout the spring and summer, so that if it would be easy for messengers to pass swiftly between himself and his wife, while she was engaged in the negotiations in France, which were the purpose of her visit. Finally, the French Parliament decided that if the King of England would surrender his claims to the Duchy of Gascony and the country of Ponthieu to Prince Edward, his eldest son, the King of France, for his part, would accord full recognition to the young prince's claim to these territories, contenting himself with the sole condition that the prince should pay him homage in respect of those lands. In addition, Charles IV, King of France, sent letters, patent and other letters concerning the safe conduct of the young prince, son of the King of England, who was to be sent to him. There was much discussion among the English, both at London and at Dover, concerning the conditions specified by the French king. Some were of the opinion that King Edward II himself should make the journey across the Channel, for they felt that his son would be vulnerable to all manner of misfortunes if he were exposed to the wily and avaricious French without the protection of his father or his English companions, who, they asked, will prevent the French king from marrying off the poor lad to some person of inferior birth, or assigning him some tutor or guardian of his own choosing. Those who argued thus were indeed justified. The two dispensers would not accept this, for however they dared neither to cross the Channel with King Edward II nor to remain behind in England in his absence. Thus the King of England granted by charter to his son Edward the Duchy of Gascony and the county of Ponthieu, to be held by the prince and his heirs, the kings of England. He added a clause to the effect that if he were to survive his son, the lands would revert to his authority, for he was afraid that other conditions of the charter might give an advantage to the King of France, if the latter could contrive to arrange a marriage for Prince Edward, or submit him to the authority of a tutor or guardian. So we have here the decorated style. Above we have the wonderful west door at Exeter Cathedral. Look at that. The increased complexity of the tracery work can be clearly seen. Tiny branches of stonework would not so much support the masonry as fill in an exposed area of glass. And in the carving beneath the forest of arches, ornaments the wall space surrounding the door. This is one of the things I love about living in England, that you do have this kind of architecture to go and see. This deep history is wonderful. Here we have an interior view of the west front stained glass window. So the impact of more stone limbs and smaller fragments of glass was to reduce the amount of light reaching the interior. But it's a stunning effect, isn't it? So in 1300, England was suddenly in the van of architectural developments, rather than hitherto struggling to keep abreast of France. It's true that the source of the English decorated style was the tracery-dominated French rayonnant of Saint-Denis and the Sainte-Chapelle. English architects still went to France for inspiration. There was no more need to invite French architects like William of Sene at Canterbury or Henry of Reign at Westminster for the major commissions. The architects of the decorated style were strictly indigenous. Two commissions from Edward I seem to have played a key role in its development. The two-level chapel of St. Stephen at Westminster Palace, the English answer to the Sainte-Chapelle, began in 1292, and the Eleanor crosses, touching memorials of a hard man for his beloved wife. Both the chapel and crosses are distinguished by the highly imaginative handling of tracery and arch forms, including the introduction of double-curved or augury arches. Gradually, these were curved not in one plane but in two, chimneys, which ripple along the walls of the Lady Chapel at Ely Cathedral. At Exeter Cathedral, rebuilt apart from its Norman towers between about 1280 and 1360, window tracery reaches new levels of complexity, patterns forming into nets and flowering flame-like shapes taking advantage of the double curve of the ogee. The vault, almost overladen with ribs, has an opulence that prefigures the Van vault. The choir of the Augustine Abbey, now Cathedral of Bristol, is in striking contrast to these richly decorated buildings. It's elegant and restrained, its spaces are open and of pristine clarity. A whole church, its aisles with narrow transverse vaults at the same height as the main nave. Both features are suggestive of the churches of Poitou and Gascony, perhaps reflecting Bristol's connection with these areas through the wine trade. Bristol's elegance and restraint are recognisable in influences on the two major works produced for Edward III, the upper levels of St. Stephen's Chapel and the choir and transepts of Gloucester Cathedral, which began in about 1330. Gloucester was intended as a mausoleum for Edward II, built by his son. Because it was too expensive to dismantle the solidly built Norman choir, vast panelled skeins of tracery were stretched across the Norman walls. And this perpendicular style, the last Gothic transmutation of medieval England, was born. So here we have some conspirators here in the Chronicle of Gregory le Baker, and in the end the chief conspirators decided that it would be wisest to gather an armed force and demand that the King of England himself appear before them. The bishops sent letters from their army to their fellow bishops and other friends, some dukes, some earls, and some French nobles, who had been sent with mighty forces by the King of France, Charles IV, to afford his royal protection to Queen Isabella, his sister. So numerous indeed were they, that there was scarce food enough in England to feed them, and the native flock abandoned by its shepherds was filled with fear. Civil war, no novelty for the English, now began again, sparked off by the armed force described above. It was not to be a lengthy affair, though, for King Edward II and his supporters were pursued by a vast army whose strength they knew they could not withstand. Consequently, they sought only to defend themselves, believing flight was their only chance. The king, when he had learned from his scouts that almost all his kingdom, terrified by false rumours, was supporting his wife, set off for Wales. He proceeded to Chepstow, accompanied by Hugh Despenser the son, Robert Baldock his chancellor, and a few other close companions. There the king boarded a ship, intending to make for Lundy Island in the River Severn. The coast consists of very steep and rugged cliffs that render any attack impossible. However, Edward's purpose was defeated by a contrary wind, and so narrowly escaping fierce storms at sea, he landed in Glamorgan and made for the Abbey and Castle of Neath. There he went into hiding, trusting too much to the false promises of the Welsh, who swore to stand by him in life and death. Queen Isabella had by now attained a position of great power, under the standard of her son Prince Edward, a lad not himself of an evil nature, but led astray by his elders to join in the revolt against his father. She gave orders that the army should be mobilised in pursuit of King Edward II. When they arrived at Oxford, Adam Orlerton, the so-called Bishop of Hereford and the chief architect of this great evil, preached a public sermon concerning the arrival of Queen Isabella and the reasons for their armed uprising. Addressing the whole university, the Queen, Prince Edward, though he was powerless, Roger Mortimer, and other followers, he took as his text, "Oh, my head, 2 Kings 4:19, using it as an authority for his argument that a feeble head should be removed from a kingdom and not protected by the support of flatterers. After that, the army moved towards Gloucester, where their numbers were significantly increased as they came from the north to support the Queen. Meanwhile, the people of London, wishing to win the goodwill of Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, wildly set upon Walter Stapleton, Bishop of Exeter, decapitating him, may he rest in peace, on the 15th of October in the middle of the city. Others who had remained faithful to the king were also murdered savagely, simply because they had stood loyally by a man who was the king's loyal servant. The bishop's head was brought to Gloucester, where the queen's army was encamped, and presented to her, as if it were a sacrifice to propitiate Diana. When her troops entered the Tower of London, they set free all who were imprisoned there, and the Queen issued a public edict that all those who were imprisoned throughout England should be set free. Those who had been banished or exiled were recalled under an amnesty. Thus did they make a pretence that the new reign was more pious and merciful than the last, for they wished to harness the greed of the populace in support of the claims of their candidate encircling, and the time of Edward II is nearing its end here through great conspiracy. But the capital of the realm here, London, was an imposing and thriving capital. The halls of the great guilds were a tangible sign of mercantile prosperity. At its centre, of course, St. Paul's Cathedral, which has a 520-foot spire, the highest in Europe at the time. But it was the tower at the eastern end of the city that symbolised the royal presence and became the focus of discontent against the hated rule of Edward II. This is it today, of course. So on the 15th of October 1326, the city of London rose in wild and bloody uproar against the hated rule of Edward II. The tower besieged, a howling mob dragged Walter Stapleton, Bishop of Exeter, from his horse and cut off his head with a butcher's knife. That is horrendous. Stapleton, who commissioned Exeter Cathedral's magnificent nave and founded Exeter College, Oxford, was an able treasurer and administrator. He had been made guardian of the city of London by Edward II and was seen by the mob as royal tyranny personified. After his death, his head was sent as a trophy to Queen Isabella at Gloucester. The disorder continued for a month until on the 15th of November a new mayor, sympathetic to Isabella and Mortimer, was elected. The incident is a graphic illustration of the Londoners' notorious violence and singular political power. The city, with the Royal Abbey and Palace at Westminster, had become the political and economic nerve centre of England during the 13th century. Kings were crowned and usually buried at Westminster Abbey. The Royal Chancery, Exchequer, Treasury, Household, the courts of the King's Bench and Common Pleas were also permanently established in the same area. Parliament and Convocation, the Council of the Bishops, met there. Its 14th century population of about 35,000 far outnumbered that of all the other cities in the land. The next largest, York, only had about 11,000 and was constantly swollen by immigrants from all ranks of society, whether the peasant coming to seek his fortune or the noble investing in a luxurious townhouse for his visits. The city was enjoying a commercial boom, as an ever-growing proportion of the lucrative wool exporting trade was handled by its companies. The wealth earned on its bustling wharves was a vital ingredient in any royal war budget. Perhaps the most striking sight was Old London Bridge, built in 1176 to 1209 and rescued from near collapse in the late 13th century. Hence the London Bridge's falling down song. At the lowest crossing point on the Thames, it had an important source of tolls, supported numerous buildings, including chapels, shops and taverns. So we have a little bit more about this plot in the chronicle here of Geoffrey le Baker. So in this chaos, good and evil became so confused with one another that thieves, murderers, and all manners of criminals did great damage, knowing that no one should stand in their way or bring them to justice. At that time, rapacity raged unchecked, so that any friend of the king, if found, would at once be stripped of his possessions or his life, and those responsible would suffer no punishment. It was enough for the conspirators that the victim had been of the king's party. In these troubled times, it was to the advantage of all criminals to add treachery to their misdeeds. Thus did many regain their liberty and the opportunity to commit new crimes. Furthermore, any who had in the past been condemned in the king's courts were now restored to their former wealth and dignity, thanks to the queen's power. Queen Isabella and her army left Gloucester and hurried to Bristol, which was held by Hugh Despenser the father. They were prepared to besiege the city and castle if necessary, but although the place was well defended, Hugh Despenser the father was overcome with despair, which had so often afflicted his party, and opened the gates of the city, throwing himself and his adherents on the mercy of that Haradan. The city and the castle were thus surrendered to that Virago the queen, who entered in at once, without another word, gave orders that Hugh be made to suffer the most extreme torture. At once that brave knight was bound, his legs and arms stretched, his belly was torn open, and his very intestines crudely ripped forth and burnt. The rest of his body was drawn by horses and then hung on a fork like that of any common thief. After this, Queen Isabella proceeded to the marches and stayed at Hereford for a month. There she divided up her army into two parts. One she sent under the command of Henry, Earl of Leicester, to capture the king and his followers, and eventually, after he dispensed bribes to the Welsh, the Earl of Leicester discovered the king with Hugh Despenser the son in the abbey at Neath. So she seems rage personified by this point. The dismembered corpse of Hugh Despenser was finally laid to rest in Tewkesbury Abbey, and this alabaster effigy is surmounted by a glorious framework of Gothic arches glorious, whose splendour is at curious odds with the evil man beneath, in quotations. So we've heard a lot about the Despensers through the account of Edward II's life, and we know they were Edward II's last favourites, descended from the early 13th century stewards of the Earls of Chester. Their surname, the French word for steward, reflects their origins in the middle ranks of the English aristocracy. So the elder Despenser held lands in the Midlands, the South and South Wales. Some were inherited, some were acquired by marriage. He was a consistently loyal servant of Edward I and, more remarkably, of Edward II. His loyalty was unshaken even by the Gaveston affair. He was much hated by Edward's enemies for his influence over the king after Gaveston's death. One chronicler described him as a worthy man who was destroyed by his devotion to his son, but in fact he profited greatly from the younger Hugh's meteoric rise to even greater power than his. In 1322 he became Earl of Winchester. The younger Despenser, born in about 1290, was betrothed by Edward I to the sister of the younger Earl of Gloucester in 1306 at the age of 16. At the start of Edward II's reign in 1307, he was a landless knight who, unlike his father, joined the baronial opposition to Gaveston. The death of the Earl of Gloucester and the Battle of Bannockburn brought him sudden and unexpected wealth and status. His wife was the heiress to 1/3 of her brother's vast estates. By 1318, the younger Hugh was Edward II's undisputed favourite and remained so until both fell from power in 1326. Like Gaveston, he was a powerful character on whom the weak king depended. Unlike Gaveston, who had been a feckless dilettante, he was a vicious, utterly immoral man whose sole purpose in life was to acquire wealth and power. Young Hugh set out to increase his estates by violence, fraud, and legal chicanery. Although he was exiled by the barons in 1321, he set up as a pirate in the English Channel. Edward recalled him after 2 months, and he embarked on a rampage of bullying and rapacity, always protected by the king. One heiress was tricked out of the lordships of Gower and Usk. Thomas of Lancaster's widow was terrorised into giving up her lands. Lady Barrett's limbs were broken until she went out of her mind. Intensely arrogant, Hugh was once heard to regret his inability to control the wind. His wealth was astonishing, as the extensions made on his behalf to the splendid castle at Caerphilly bear out, and he was so proud that he had made no effort to recruit support in the kingdom. The Despenser regime was based on fear alone, and it collapsed like a pack of cards in 1326 when Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer invaded England. The elder Hugh, whose unpopularity groaned with that of his son, was strung high on the public gallows at Bristol in 1326, vilified by the mob as a traitor. The younger Hugh was executed at Hereford, also in 1326. Fear may feel like an easy transactional route to power, but it always is taken away just as quickly. The people you kick on the way up will be those that spit on you on the way down, of course. So we're talking a lot about crime, punishment and spectacle here, and up here we've got a criminal tried before an official. No jury was considered necessary at the time. The prisoner is chained up, presumably because his guilt's already assumed, and such calls were held by lords of the manor as well as by local sheriffs and administrators of the king's lands. Having been found guilty, the prisoner is paraded publicly through the streets on the way to his punishment, and such humiliation was considered part of the judicial process. This here, Hugh Despenser's execution, was certainly not the comparatively humane beheading according to royal favourites. He was crowned with nettles, hanged from gallows 50 feet high, genitals cut off, and burnt in front of him to punish his heresy and sodomy, and finally beheaded. As he went to his execution, a catalogue of his crimes was recited. The venom of his executioners and their vilification of his crimes put them into a category of brutally exceptional, even by the often inhumane standards of the medieval age. And obviously, as these were quite public, I can't wrap my head around the public tolerance for seeing such grim and grisly violent acts against human beings. It must have completely changed your relationship with the human body and the human entity. So when Sir John Le Breton, a Norfolk gentleman, found out that his daughter had a nocturnal assignation with Sir Godfrey Millers, a married man with grown children, he dealt with the matter very simply. As Sir Godfrey crept into the house, he was met by the whole family, who strung him feet first from the rafters and castrated him. This incident in 1248 typifies the common image of medieval crime: abundant lawlessness, wanton savagery, weak policing by central government. Sir John ended his days in exile as a result of his actions that night, but Henry III did little for the rule of law when he declared such behaviour to be illegal, except by husbands who caught men with their wives. The 13th and 14th centuries were rich in spectacular and bloody crimes, often unpunished, and the society which provided the backcloth for the tales of Robin Hood is easily seen as virtually ungovernable. The reality was less grim. England was undoubtedly difficult to police. Major crimes were committed in the course of political disputes. Large numbers of itinerant poor, who provided plenty of larceny, robbery, cattle rustling and horse stealing. Some of these problems were fed by national affairs. The power struggles under Henry III and Edward II allowed property to be seized under the guise of civil war, while the demobilisation of the armies after Edward I's successful campaigns against Scotland and Wales let loose thousands of freebooters upon the civilian population. No king was strong enough to exercise control over all the sources of the disorder, but the mechanisms of law and order were there and continued to function and develop, even during the most lawless times of Edward II's reign. Petty crime was tried and punished through a comprehensive network of local courts that operated regularly and according to well-established customary laws. Although these courts were mostly in the hands of the gentry or their deputies, the Crown took a direct interest in them, partly by regulation, partly by piecemeal takeover, and partly by providing rival courts under the jurisdiction of the sheriff. The Crown also experimented with the courts for trying serious crimes. Under Henry III, the Eyrie, a circuit by judges and administrators from Westminster who reviewed and, if necessary, tried all of the crime in a county since the previous visitation, was used to assert royal control throughout the country. When this institution broke down under a succession, courtly sessions, held mostly by lay magistrates from the county, were established to hear all offences and try the most serious ones. Some cases, however, were sent up to the justices of assize, central court judges travelling around counties during their Easter and summer vacations, and court sessions and assizes survived without fundamental change for 6 centuries. So we have more here from the Chronicle as the times of Edward II are drawing to a close. They added, twisting the truth to suit their own purposes, that he would lay up for himself great rewards in heaven if he were to give up his earthly power, so that his subjects might once again enjoy peace and tranquillity. They threatened that if he refused to give up his crown, the people would cease to accord him homage and obedience and would reject his sons also, choosing instead some other king not of royal blood. These and other importunate promises and threats eventually wore down the resistance of King Edward II's brave and pious heart, although not without sobs, tears, and sighs. He agreed to do as the bishops advised. Finally, that wicked ambassador, Adam Orlerton, Bishop of Hereford, brought the other members of the commission to the castle where King Edward was imprisoned. They assembled in his chamber in the order of rank, the Bishop of Hereford insisting on being treated with the honour that he had long coveted. At length the King of England, clothed in mourning, came forth from the inner chamber and appeared before his servants, knowing full well the nature of their business. So great indeed was the sorrow weighing upon him that all at once he fell down in a faint. The Earl of Leicester and the Bishop of Winchester ran to help the semi-conscious king and raised him up. As soon as Edward was recovered, Adam Orlerton, Bishop of Hereford, addressed him, setting forth the reason for their visit. He had no hesitation in attempting to soften the king's heart with persuasion, blushing not at the thought that he had done more than any other man to gain the king's enmity. He added that it was the king's duty to hand over his crown to his son, for if he refused, they would choose another king to be king, who knew better how to protect his kingdom. When the king heard this, he wept and lamented, replying that it grieved him much, as if his people were so enraged against him that they could endure his rule no longer. Lastly, he said it would please him very much if the people would accept his son Edward as king. On the following day, William Trussell, the spokesman for the deputation from the whole kingdom, renounced their homage and fealty to Edward of Carnarvon, lately their king. Sir Thomas Blount, steward of the royal household, broke the rod, which was the symbol of his office, and declared that he was released from the service of the royal house. The delegation then returned to London to Parliament, when they delivered the king's reply in full, embroidered with their own additions. was familiar and eager for whatever is new, accepted the abdication of Edward II gladly, and at once promoted his eldest son, Prince Edward, who was only 11 years of age. Some indeed were all the more willing to support him on account of his tender years, for they hoped they would themselves be able to exert influence over a flock whose shepherd was so green. The Queen, now merely Lady Isabella of Carnarvon, was allowed so great a sum as dower that her son, the new King Edward, and his wife, Queen Philippa, were left with scarcely a third of the crown lands. Edward II, however, who remained in the custody of Henry, Earl of Leicester, was allowed 100 marks per month from the royal treasury, on the instructions of Isabella, the Bishop of Hereford, and Roger Mortimer. And so the noble Lord Edward, who had once been king, patiently suffered the loss of his royal crown and of his liberty. He continued to stay with Henry, Earl of Leicester, where he lived a retired life like that of a monk, yet as a servant of God. Though afflicted by the most wretched of misfortunes, he complained little, regretting only that his wife, whom he could not cease to love, refused to see him, for he had been a stranger to her arms for more than a year, and that she would not permit his son, who was now king, nor any of his other children to visit him, and thus bring him some comfort. That must have been hard. Almost in a bit of a non sequitur, we have the art of cleanliness here, and a detail from a 14th century French ivory comb, delicately carved with two lovers. I absolutely love these little carvings, they're beautiful. This is a public wash house. So apart from providing people with a place they could get clean, public baths were also a meeting place for friends to pass the hours. Baths were sometimes prescribed as well by doctors as a source of treatment. A 13th century manuscript of Roger of Salerno's Chirurgia shows a patient taking a bath under medical supervision. Bathers used wooden tubs, in some cases marble ones, with heated water nearby. Soap was used. Its principal ingredient was goat's tallow and beech ash until they were replaced by olive oil. So, illustrations in the 14th century manuscripts depict figures with neatly done hair, well-trimmed beards, dressed in the height of contemporary fashion. For the rich, style and cleanliness were important in themselves, also a tangible demonstration of power and sophistication. Bathhouses were important social centres, and had been for some 260 years in southern Europe. Sophisticated baths were marble or other stone. An eastern one was made from an Egyptian sarcophagus, but other more portable versions were, for more than one person, were made of wood, often in the shape of a tub, formed of wooden staves, held together by horizontal metal hoops. Communal bathing was generally a social occasion. Food and drink was on hand. Water was heated in large bronze cauldrons over a log fire and poured over the bather or bathers with bronze or pottery bowls. Sponges were imported from the Mediterranean. Soap was made with olive oil. England was an important centre of production. Perfumes or their equivalents were valued not only for their fragrance, but also because they were thought to have the power to ward off disease. They included ambergris, the secretion of the sperm whale, musk, and other natural perfumes from plants and flowers. Rosewater, lavender, sandalwood, and nutmeg were the most common. Where rarer perfumes were worn around the neck in special containers, often pierced gold or silver spheres, containing a sort of sponge soaked in perfume. Wow, that must have been strong. Combs for the toilette were made of wood or bone. Beautifully carved examples in ivory were used to comb the hair of bishops or priests preparing to say mass. There were less sophisticated versions in wood or stamped leather cases. Glass mirrors had been recently invented and only came into general use during the next century. Cutthroat razors used for shaving. Dentistry was primitive. Complicated techniques such as crowning and filling are discussed in contemporary medical texts. Many remedies are given for toothache, but there's little attempt at preventing tooth decay, which must have been very common in the 14th century. So we have now been brought on to Edward II's ultimate fate. Here is his cell, the scene of his murder. And what we'll see in a moment is Berkeley Castle, a formidable prison where he ended his life. So in April 1327, the deposed Edward II was taken away from Kenilworth Castle and imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire in the custody of Thomas, Lord of Berkeley. Although 2 attempts were made to rescue him, the second in early September 1327, he died at Berkeley Castle in the same month. Adam of Myrmouth, a contemporary, writes, although many abbots, priors, knights and burgesses of Bristol and Gloucester were once summoned to inspect the body whole, and thus looked at it superficially. It was widely rumoured that the king had been cunningly killed on the orders of John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney, his jailers. Because of this, these two and certain others fled. On the 21st of September 1327, it was officially announced at the Lincoln Parliament that Edward was dead, and on the 21st of December a solemn funeral was held for him at Gloucester Abbey, where a flourishing cult soon grew up around his supposed remains. Most of Edward's contemporaries assumed that he had been murdered. The fact that Queen Isabella had had his heart removed from the corpse and placed it in a silver vase, which was later buried in her own coffin, was seen as an open announcement of apparent remorse. Yet no one was convicted of killing the king. Thomas, Lord of Berkeley, had been absent when the death took place and was soon acquitted. Maltravers, who escaped a perfunctory trial by fleeing abroad in 1330, was pardoned some 20 years later and taken into Edward III's service. In a letter written to Edward III, Manuel de Fieschi, a canon of York and high papal official who claimed to have met and confessed Edward II, gives an apparently well-founded account of how the king escaped from Berkeley Castle to wander across Europe, first as a fugitive, then as a hermit. Finally, de Fieschi writes, they sent Edward to Berkeley Castle. Later, the attendant who guarded him told him, Sire, Thomas Gurney and Simon Beresford have come to kill you, but if it pleases you, I will give you my clothes so that you may escape. Edward, dressed in these clothes, crept out of his prison by night and reached the outermost door unchallenged because he was not recognised. Finding the porter asleep, he immediately killed him, took the keys of the door, opened it and escaped with his former guard. The knights who had come to kill Edward saw that he had gone, and fearing the queen's anger and terrified for their lives, they put the porter in a chest, having first cut out its heart. They presented the porter's heart and body to the wicked queen as if they were your father's. The porter was buried at Gloucester as the body of the king. Edward and his companion were received at Corfe Castle by the Castellan Thomas, without the knowledge of his lord John Maltravers, and the king remained secretly at Corfe for a year and a half. Later he crossed to Ireland, where he stayed for 8 months, but he was afraid that he might be recognised there. Putting on the clothes of a hermit, he came back to England, went to Sandwich, and crossed to Shays, then travelled to Normandy and on to Avignon. Here Edward gave a florin to a papal servant and sent a note to Pope John the 22nd. The Pope summoned him and for more than 15 days kept him in secrecy and honour. Finally Edward departed and went to Paris, then to Brabant, and then took alone to see the three kings and offer his devotions. He next crossed Germany and reached Milan, where he entered a hermitage at Milazzo Castle, staying there for 2.5 years. Because this castle was involved in a war, he moved on to another hermitage near Sesima in the diocese of Pavia and Lombardy, and the king remained in the last hermitage for some 2 years in seclusion, praying for us and for other sinners. However, no independent corroborative evidence for this story has ever been found. And here we have Berkeley Castle. You can see it resembles somewhat the Tower of London to a degree. Here we have the courtyard, we have walls encircling it, towers encircling it, and a prison-like tower in the centre. Very classical style. So that brings us to the end of Edward II's life and reign. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been full of juicy detail and scandal. I look forward to having you join me next time for Edward III's reign.